Okay, so we took a detour last week and did some prophecy stuff, some of that weird stuff. We're jumping back into Daniel. This is session 7, Daniel chapter 6. And this is a very popular and familiar story to everyone. And sometimes things that are familiar, you can miss some things. And so I think there might be some surprises and some discoveries that you get from this famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. And we're going to dive into some things. So before, I know we got some new people. Let's take, oh, what happened? Let's do this right here. This is some of the crazy core beliefs that Bible Bootcamp has. And I'm going to put this out here. And your task is not to believe me or what we are, but to prove me wrong on this. But number one, first one, I don't think you can read that. The guiding principles of how we view and understand Scripture. How do you view the Bible? Okay. Number one, that's not just 40 guys who wrote 66 books over 2,000 years. The entire Bible is engineered by one person, the Holy Spirit. Not everyone believes that, but one person wrote the entire Bible. The same author of Genesis is the one. And people argue, but you don't debate me, you debate 2 Timothy 3:16, which talks about this, right? So yeah, because it was just written by a man, how can a man talk about my life in 2021? Second, the entire Bible is written from outside of our time dimension. How can Daniel write about 2021, 2,500 years ago? How would he know? He would have no idea, right? And yet, the Bible is written from outside of time. You can actually prove that. How can you prove it? Because it predicts history in advance. It predicts the events of time, and it's done it in the past, and it's continued to do that. And the third one is the entire Bible is a supernatural document from the creator of the universe that will survive into eternity. There's two things that's going to survive the fire: God's people and God's word. And there is a promise, Psalm 119, Revelation 20, that the Bible, maybe not this piece of cardboard, but God's word will be read in heaven. It's going to survive into eternity. You're going to contemplate Scripture. So, we can get caught up in the world, and we can get caught up in, what is it, Susan, you're on TikTok and all that stuff right there. Social media, your streaming services, all those things are going to burn up. Our homes are going to burn up. Our vehicle's going to burn up. Our boat, our lake house is going to burn up. Two things will survive: God's people and the Bible, right? So why do we not, and I put those there because this is hard for people. You remember that we talked about the generations of people that read the Bible at least 3 times a year. And when it started with the World War II generation, 72% of them read the Bible at least 3 times a year, which is a low standard. That's not very high, 3 times a year. And then you get to the baby boomers and it's 60%, and you get to Gen X and it's 50%. And you get to millennials and it's 33%, Gen Z, 9%. Read the Bible 3 times a year, right? So why? Because there's so many other things that capture their attention. And yet all those things will burn up, and this will last into eternity. So there you go. Those are 3 core values. And I'm putting those out there because we're going to talk about some stuff tonight. And let's just jump into it. I call this level 3 for lack of a better term. And those of you that are in FastFit, you know that everything we do is level 3, right? You have level 1, level 2, level 3 options. And the Bible can be seen in much the same way. There's multiple layers of interpreting the Bible. Obviously, everything in Daniel, there's a historical event. Okay, we know that Jerusalem fell. That's in history. We knew that Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream and was interpreted. He wrote about that. We know about the fiery furnace of it. That's in history. We know that Nebuchadnezzar wrote chapter 4. That's in history. The fall of Babylon, that's historical. So it's all historical. I got to tell you, I always think about this. This is probably a flaw on my part. But as we've gone through this study of Daniel, I've kind of picked up different things, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We found that clay prism in Istanbul on in their museum that writes about that event, that writes about those 3 guys. And sometimes I discover these, I'm like, see, the Bible is true. And why is it that we get excited? Because something was dug up in the desert that proves the Bible. How wrong is that, right? No. The Bible, you either believe the Bible's true or not. We don't have to dig something up to discover it, but it is kind of cool when you find it where it matches up. Actually, those things that are discovered proves that it's right. But these are all historical events, but there's another layer to that. And that is there's a practical application. So each of these events that we've had in Daniel, yes, they're historical, but you can learn from it, right? when Daniel was taken hostage as a 14-year-old and went over there and they tried to get him to eat foods that the Torah forbid him to eat, and he took a stand of faith, there's a practical application. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, there's some practical application. Tonight, you're going to see same thing. There's a historical event that's going to take place, but there's also a practical. But the third level of this, and this is all throughout Daniel, and probably you could make a case for all throughout the Bible, everything is linked to the future. So there's a prophetical element to it. So it's not just the story of the lion's den. There's a practical takeaway we're going to see, and there's also a prophetical aspect of it. So that's what we're going to try to do. Let's do a little recap here, because we're coming to the end of a section of Daniel. Everything's been kind of the historical part of it, the events. Starting next week, it's going to be into the visions and prophecies, and we're going to get into some deep stuff. So we've been doing the fun stuff so far, and we'll get kind of deep starting next week. But here's a little bit of a recap. So chapter 1, Jerusalem falls. And here's this kid, 14 years old. He's part of the royal family, some form. So you got David, Solomon, and all the kings, and he's part of that line. And he gets taken away. He's taken over and put into this academic program to become an advisor at age 14. And the interesting thing you're going to see, and this comes out to play tonight, there's something about Daniel that people like. I don't know what it is. When they stormed Jerusalem, they didn't kill him. The guy, the general, liked him for some reason. There's something about him he liked. And he didn't kill him. He says, I'm going to take you back to Babylon, you and your 3 buddies. So he takes him over there. When he takes him over there, this guy right here is kind of their academic advisor. He comes to like Daniel. He writes about him. He's a good-looking kid. There's a good spirit about him. He likes him. And then he gets taken to King Nebuchadnezzar. And as a king, he likes him. And we're going to see that tonight. All throughout his life, people liked Daniel. He's the one of only 2 people that the Bible has nothing bad to say about outside of Jesus. Okay. But do you know the other one is? Daniel. Who else is the Bible doesn't have anything bad to say about him? Joseph. Interesting. Both of them interpret dreams too. Both of them were slaves, so to speak. Right. And both of them found favor with people above. So anyway, so in chapter 1, he took this stand of faith. He, and that won him some favor with the king. And then chapter 2, it happens the very next year. You've got Daniel gets taken hostage, taken over to this Babylon. His spiritual gift is interpreting dreams. So he's over there under Nebuchadnezzar, and suddenly Nebuchadnezzar gets a dream. Imagine that. God sends him a dream about this statue. He demands his advisors interpret it. They can't do it. So he says, off with your heads. He's going to kill all of them. He's going to slaughter all the advisors. Daniel happens to be part of it. Him and his 4 buddies, they're in this advisory program. So they're going to be killed. And of course, this includes Daniel's 3 buddies. Daniel ends up interpreting the dream. And what the dream turns out to be is this metal man statue that reveals every empire to the end of time. And it lists that, but there's going to be a rock that smashes it. And we're going to learn more about this statue next week. And that brought to chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue, orders a big day of celebration from all over the world to come in. And they're supposed to bow to it. Daniel's 3 buddies, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to do it. They receive the death penalty, thrown into the fiery furnace. And I called it Jesus to the rescue, because apparently somebody came into the fire and protected them in there. So, and he's so amazed, he elevates the 3 to head advisors. So they are now in this kingdom high up in there. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar gets a second dream. And once again, he asks his advisors to interpret it. Daniel's brought in to deliver the meaning of this tree that's going to cover the earth. It's going to be cut down, but the roots are going to be saved. And that's all talking God's message to him to not be so prideful, or else he's going to be cut down. He doesn't listen. A year later, he goes into this insanity phase. And then and Daniel was his nurse during that time. And then he personally writes a public testimony and delivers it to the world. And then last time we got to a single event, October 12th, 529, the night Babylon fell. And you got to think, here's Daniel at this time. He was 14 when his city got taken over and it fell. This is 529. He's no longer a 14-year-old. He's probably about 82 years old. He's been there for 68 years. And the cool thing about him, he's been studying his Bible, and he's reading the scroll of Jeremiah and the scroll of Isaiah. Jeremiah explains that the Jews will be in captivity for 70 years, and he's been there 68. Isaiah says this empire he's living in is going to be taken down by somebody named Cyrus. So he puts these two together. And of course, here is living in this city. And you remember the events, you can't really see it here. They didn't have great cameras, but it's pretty good back then. This is actually, okay. But you see these little pillars that was all around it. It doesn't look like they're very tall, but it's the same height as the Regent's building downtown. So imagine all those all the way around the city. It's a 15 square mile. You can't get into it. There's a river that runs around it. And so it's impossible to get in. And yet what happened, they're going to kind of drain the swamp, so to speak. This, by the way, so this is Euphrates. What happened was and by the way, this is an outline of what Babylon was. Okay. You see where it says the royal palace? That's where that all took place at, Daniel 5. But you see the Ishtar gates. That was kind of like that little main street. That's where you entered Babylon in. That processional way was like the main street downtown. But they have, let me see if I got this. They have started to rebuild some of this. Yeah, so this is what it originally looked like. You walked in, there's Ishtar gate. That's what it looked like. They've rebuilt this. Here it is right now. They've done it. They're rebuilding all of Babylon. So we talk about Babylon's not done yet. It is on its way back. So the takedown of Babylon, what happened was on September 20th, Cyrus captures all the towns upstream, diverts the Euphrates River to a different direction. So this is 2 days before it happens. The water's going down. He sends in his troop on October 12th. And apparently the historians say the water dropped to waist height and the soldiers slipped in under the gate without anyone noticing. It would be 3 days before most of the citizens even realized they'd been taken over. And Cyrus, this guy, how smart is he? He took down two nations. Media, think about northern Iran and Iraq. He takes both of them down without a battle. He studied how to take them down, and both of them, there was no bloodshed. Smart guy. And speaking of Letter to Cyrus, we kind of wrap things up because this happened afterwards. 9 days after that event, Cyrus the Great makes his grand entrance into Babylon. And what happens? He is met by Daniel, this 82-year-old man who hands him the book of Isaiah and points it out to where there's a personal letter to him in Isaiah 45 that calls him by name. And so Cyrus was so impressed. By the way, it died 150 years before Cyrus was even born. He was so impressed that he frees all the Jews and returns all the temple vessels back to Israel. So you can read about that in 2 Chronicles. And that brought us to this. We finished off chapter 5. That was kind of a big warm up there. But this is how the chapter 5 finished off. It says, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius the Mede. Wait a minute. Shouldn't that say Cyrus? Wasn't it Cyrus that did that? So one of the big confusing things as you get into chapter 6, you're going to hear about this guy, Darius. Where did he come from? I thought Cyrus conquered Babylon. And so there's a lot of things. Darius, and you're going to hear, he's going to be one of the main characters in chapter 6. If you read it, you already know that. Might have been a title that meant holder of the scepter. There's 5 Persian kings that all use this title Darius. So it could have been something like, well, in our world, Prince. One of the great musical artists of our day, Prince Rogers Nelson, right? But it's also a title. So Prince could be a name, Prince could be a title. Darius might be something like that. So there's a couple options. Darius might be Cyrus himself. Some people think this might be Cyrus. Another option, some people think it's his son. However, it said he took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So it's hard for me to believe that would be his son. This could be just somebody that he appointed with the title Darius. And another option is this guy named Ugbaru, which is a governor appointed over Babylon by Cyrus. Who is Ugbaru? Well, Ugbaru was the general that led the assault on Babylon that night, okay? On October 12th, the 17 days later, Cyrus made his grand entrance, and he appointed Ugbaru, they believe, to rule over Babylon. So Cyrus is going to be the king, and he's going to kind of be the governor over this state, so to speak. But then Ugbaru dies just 1 week later, according to the records in Persia. So Darius was 62 when he took over. Ugbaru could be another name for that. So anyway, as we go through this, that's still a lot of questions about who this is. But let's get on with it. Verse 1. Here we go. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 governors, satraps over the kingdom. So this is a big kingdom right here, right? It'd be like having the president appoint 50 governors over 50 states. over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over these guys, over them, 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them and that the king might not suffer loss. They were basically, these 3 commissioners would basically oversee all the governors or the princes of these regions, so that he would basically do the counting, the bookkeeping. So they weren't losing money. That's what, so you got 3 of these guys, but of the 3 that's over all of them, then this Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Let's keep in mind here, this guy, he starts off as 14 years old, works his way up. Nebuchadnezzar, he becomes second under Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylon Empire, right? Second in command. 70 years later, it falls. He's now in his 80s. A new king comes in. He finds favor with him. He likes him so much, he's going to make him a prime minister of that empire. I mean, has anybody ever had a resume that says they're prime minister of 2 empires? I don't think so. And there's something about him that distinguishes himself. What is it? Because he's a foreigner, right? Like, these are Iranians that came in and took over Iraq, and he's neither one. He's Israeli. He's a Jew. So he's not one of them, and yet this guy likes him so much. So there's something that says something about Daniel in his favor. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to, I think it says, Jeff in the box is killing me right now. There you go. Trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. They tried to find something wrong with him. Have you ever seen people that just run for some type of office and see what people do? They will dig up some form of dirt on you, right? Like, and here it is. They could find nothing wrong with Daniel, and they're searching. They want to find something wrong with him. Number one, this guy's not one of them. They've already been a part of an empire, and he's coming in, and the king's elevating him above them. I would say, you know, how many of you guys could have that same kind of resume? Like, take a show of hands if you have nothing wrong ever done. Like, you've done nothing ever, right? What's that saying? It's like, if you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? You know, were you raising your hand? Okay, just check. Okay, all right. Okay. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." If you've worked in a place, this is classic envy. Like, if you've worked in any place, you know that there is there's an element of people that, even if you're doing well, people can get jealous, and there can be problems, right? I was in my previous life, I was a basketball coach at Arkansas Baptist, and I came in and took over the girls' basketball program. And that school had been there for a while, and there's a lot of people that had been there through the whole time. They'd been there when they were this little bitty school, and they'd start to grow. And so they'd been there from the lean years to where they were there. I didn't know nothing about their history. And the superintendent at the time came, and he met with me, and he, for some reason, he really liked me, and I already had another job. And I told him, here's what I'm making. And they offered me a contract that was really good. He says, we'll beat that. So they gave me a contract, signed it, went to work for them. Didn't realize that there were people that were there that had been there for a decade or so that were not making as much as I was. And I'm the new kid on the block. I have no idea what anybody makes. They just offered me a contract. I said, and okay, here you go. And went in there. Well, one of the coaches somehow found out what I was making. I don't know how he did, but it caused a lot of problems. And it wasn't anything, necessarily what I was doing, because I was new kid there. But you can see how that happens with people, right? Happens all the time. But I love this. We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Only his faith is a way that we can bring him down. Interesting. Then these commissioners, satraps, came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. That's their way of saying, that's an old expression, by the way. Long live the king, that kind of thing. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. That's kind of a dumb thing to set up, if you think about it. But people, it's amazing how flattery will convince people to do stuff, right? Now, do you really believe that all the commissioners and all the important government officials there? Well, probably not, because Daniel wasn't invited to this. He didn't agree to it. And by the way, we're going to cast him into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish an injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. You remember Daniel, when he was way back as a teenager, he interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And part of that dream was, he said, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to be the head of gold, but there's going to be an empire that comes after you that is inferior to you. They're not going to be as awesome as you are. That's going to be the Medes and the Persians, the arms and chests of silver, right? Daniel knew that. Well, one of the things, remember, Nebuchadnezzar was all powerful. He could do anything he wanted to. Matter of fact, if you think back to chapter 5, when he goes in there to read the writing on the wall, before he interprets it, he says, let me tell you something. He was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Your grandfather, who he wanted to kill, he killed. Who he wanted to honor, he honored. He did anything he wanted to. He was all powerful. The Medes and the Persians wasn't like that. When they put something into law, it was a law and the king couldn't change it. It's a little bit like how our Constitution, we're bound by that, right? Or at least we should. But that's a little bit how it was. So whatever he puts into law, the king can't overrule that. So he's not all powerful. And so that's why Daniel said the Persians are going to be inferior to you. So these guys, apparently, these jokers know that. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, of course, and put in the injunction. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. There is a lot of stuff to this verse right here that you could talk about. Number one, let's just start with this. Daniel is, although he's probably 83 by now, by the way, he knows what's going on. He knows they're out to get him. You can probably sense that. King signs a document, right? And he's going to go and he's going to do exactly what he always does, and that is pray 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening. And he's not going to change. It's against the law now. And there's a practical lesson right there that he's going to pray regardless of it being against the law. Second thing that's interesting here is open towards Jerusalem. He had windows that were open towards Jerusalem. Tell you, we're gonna do this. We're gonna do something crazy and open up our Bibles. Turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 6. I want to show you why Daniel has his windows open towards Jerusalem. That's back in the Old Testament, after the 1 Chronicles. And let me just kind of set this up here. You guys have probably heard about David. King David was this great king of Israel. He wanted to build a temple to God because God was in a tabernacle. He wants to build a temple. God said, no. You go and get everything. Basically, David paid the money. He set all the money up front for it. But Solomon's going to build the temple. And Solomon becomes king at 20, and he spends the first decade building this elaborate temple for God, right? Then he's going to have this big dedication ceremony. So Solomon's out speaking to all the people, and he's going to dedicate it. But here's some of the things he's going to say. So we're going to skip down to verse 16. And 2 Chronicles verse 16 says, Now, O Lord God of Israel, carry out the additional promise you made to your servant David, my father. For you said to him, if your descendants guard their behavior and faithfully follow my law, as you have done, one of them will always be on the throne of Israel. Now, O Lord God of Israel, fulfill this promise to your servant David. And I meant to drop down to verse 19, I meant to say. So I'm going to drop on down there. Nevertheless, listen to my prayer and plea, saying this for the people. O Lord, my God, hear the cry and the prayers that your servant is making to you. May you watch over this temple day and night, this place where you have said you would put your name. Where did he put his name at? God put his name in temple in Jerusalem in Israel. May you hear the humble and earnest requests from me and your people Israel when we pray toward this place. He's going to repeat that. Pray to this place. Yes, hear us from heaven where you live, and when you hear, forgive. If someone wrongs another person and is required to take an oath of innocence in front of your altar at this temple, then hear from heaven and judge between your servants, the accuser and the accused. Verse 24, if your people Israel are defeated by their enemies because they have sinned against you, and if they turn back and acknowledge your name and pray to you here in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people in Israel and return them to this land. And you gave them into their ancestors. If the skies are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you. In our day and age, it could be like rain was their commerce, right? They were agriculture. What if you started getting a loss of revenue in your bank account? And if you then pray toward this temple and acknowledge your name and turn from the sins because you have punished them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sins of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them to follow the right path and send rain on your land that you have given to your people as their special possession. If there is a famine in the land, or a plague, or crop disease, or attacks of locusts or caterpillars, or if your people's enemies are in the land besieging their towns, which happened, whatever disaster or disease there is, and if your people Israel pray about their troubles or sorrow, raising their hands toward this temple, then hear from heaven where you live and forgive. Give your people what their actions deserve, for you alone know each human heart. In the future, foreigners who do not belong to your people Israel will hear of you. They will come from distant lands where they hear of your great name and your strong hand and your powerful arm. And when they pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven where you live and grant them what they ask you. He goes on and on and on, and it's over. It's repeated in 2 Chronicles 6, 1 Kings 8. Pray towards this temple. Pray towards Jerusalem. Pray towards Israel. That's what Daniel's doing. As a good student of Scripture, he knows what Solomon said, and Solomon is his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather or something. He's going to pray. Now, the interesting thing is there is no Jerusalem at this time. It was burned to the ground. There's no temple. It was burned to the ground. And yet, morning, noon, and night, or evening, he's going to pray towards that place, towards Israel, towards Jerusalem, towards the temple, even though it doesn't exist. It shows you his faith. It's interesting he does that. And he keeps the windows open. So he goes upstairs to his apartment, and these guys have got the room bugged or something because they know what's going on. And he's not going to hide from it. He's just going to do it, right? Also, you could do a little study on prayer. How is he praying? He's kneeling, right? Now, do you have to kneel to pray to God? No, you don't. I spend most of my time praying when I'm behind the wheel, drive down 630. You probably need to pray. But, but there's something about kneeling. You go to, I think it's Luke 22. What is Jesus doing? He's kneeling in prayer. When you get to Acts chapter 7, Stephen, before he gets stoned, what's he doing? He's praying to God by kneeling. You get to Acts chapter 9, I think it's Peter. He's kneeling. There's case after case of people kneeling there. Do we have to kneel to pray to God? No, we don't. But there is something about being in that form there. And he's doing it 3 times a day. You're going to learn also, Daniel is a prayer. When we get to a few chapters down the road, he's going to pray again. And he always prays at evening time, twilight. And there's something to that. So anyway, let's move on with that. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. So they caught him in the act of praying. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? What they're doing is they want to make sure, hey, you did sign that, right? I want to make sure the ink is dry because we just caught somebody breaking it. The king replied, the statement is true. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Again, their system, once you put it in the law, the king doesn't have the power to revoke it. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, which is one of the exiles from Judah. This is a little bit of a put down. He's one of those guys. He's an exile. He's a slave from Israel. Pays no attention to you, O God, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Notice this. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. And he's not mad at Daniel. He's mad at himself, right? And set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. And he's not by himself. He's getting with all his attorneys and accountants, and he's trying to find a loophole. Is there any way out of this law that I've put in there? And it stresses him out. It shows you how he views this guy. I don't know how old he is. I don't know if this is Cyrus or Darius, but he, even as an 83-year-old man, Daniel, there's something about him that people just like. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. It is the death penalty for anyone who doesn't. Basically, is what they're saying. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and put into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. That's an interesting statement. Do you think he believed that? Do you think he's a believer? I don't know. I mean, sometimes Nebuchadnezzar, I feel like, and this totally has hints of chapter 3, right? With the fiery furnace, same kind of thing. They broke the law, so to speak, and there was some conniving going on, some political maneuvering. Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. I don't know if that's wishful thinking or he actually believed it. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. You know, you can't help but think about some of the parallels between this. Consider, he is basically he's giving, by law, he has received death. And there's going to be a stone that seals him up. And in a sense, he's going to raise from the dead, so to speak, and all. And the guy that is putting him in there has doubts about it. And when you start to look at Pilate and what he wrote and what he said, you know, there's people that's made the case that Pilate became a believer. I don't know. But, this is the same guys in the same situation. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles. So the king wasn't all powerful. It had to have these other congressmen and senators around to make it happen, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. This guy's going to stay up all night stressing over this. I tend to think that Daniel wasn't stressed that night. I think he probably had a nice nap, probably laying on the lion's back. I don't know. I foresee that. But this guy was worried about it. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. Probably the minute the sun's coming up, he's out there. He's hustling. He hasn't slept, and he's fearful because he knows what's going on. When he came near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? There's got to be a hint there that he believed that it was possible. Now, whether he believes in God or not, I don't know, but he is hopeful here. See what happens. Then Daniel spoke to the king. O king, live forever. Long live the king. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. You know, going back to the parallels between this and chapter 3, what saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Jesus. Now, some would say it was the angel of the Lord, but in many cases, Jesus in the Old Testament is the angel of the Lord. So whether it was an angel or was Jesus of the Lord, I don't know. I kind of tend to think that it was Jesus Christ himself, an Old Testament version. This doesn't say that, but it makes me wonder in the same regard that Daniel and his 3 buddies, was it an angel or was it the angel of the Lord? Was it Jesus himself once again making an appearance and having a nice little, sleepover with Daniel? I don't know. Maybe reading too much into it, but that's where I went with it because I kept thinking about chapter 3 here. But look also what he says. Hey, the angel shut the lion's mouth. They've not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. He's basically saying, you know what? I didn't break any laws, and I didn't do anything against you either. Now they had to they had to a little bit like jab him a little bit, like, I didn't do anything wrong. You put me in here, and I was innocent. So it had to kind of like. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted God. And these guys that put him in there, they are never going to bother Daniel again for a couple of reasons. We're going to get to that. They were breakfast. Then king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children and their wives, into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of them before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. There wasn't just one lion. They found some of these pits. Like they would put dozens. These are like man-eating sharks on land. that are just waiting for meat. And they got, there's 120 of those governors. So there's probably close to 300 people, 300 that are thrown in there, and they were all crushed. Then Darius the king wrote to all the people and nations and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. Notice this, the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar did. He wrote to not to people in Babylon or in Persia, but to all the people in all the nations and in every language. And here's what he's writing: who were living in land, may your peace abound. By the way, he just experienced what's called Lex Talianis, which is a Aramaic and Latin word that means an eye for an eye. Okay. Persian records show that this was how they handled false accusations. We kind of have laws for slander. We don't really use it. And if you just want to see an example of that, just jump on this new website called Twitter. You know, you can slander anybody and there's no repercussions, right? You can say whatever you want to. You can accuse people and it doesn't matter. You can get canceled, though. You can get canceled. I think about Judge Kavanaugh and all the accusations they had against him. Well, he had to prove himself innocent, but there was nothing against the accusers, right? And Persian records, that's not how they would handle it. It was eye for an eye. But you also see this back in Israel under God. When he established a nation, he does this with Nathan, Ugbaru, and Korah. In Numbers 16 and Deuteronomy 19, false accusations. But God was a little bit more lenient because he made it specifically that the wife and the kids would not bear the penalty for what the husband did. So it was only the accuser. But to bring this up here, what would happen, just to give you an example, if you sexually assaulted, if a man raped a woman, capital crime, what happens? That man is then taken outside of the city and all the people stone him to death. End of the problem, right? I mean, you got to think, when you study Israel and when God established a nation, there was no police force, there were no jails, and there was no need for police or prisons. Right? Because if someone did wrong, you eliminate that person and you kill them and they're in discussion. But also it flips around. If a woman falsely accused the man of rape and she falsely accused him, then she took on his penalty and she would be stoned. No more. So how many sexual assaults and false accusations were back then? Not very many if you knew you were going to get stoned to death. By the way, here I found this word, is for slander. The Aramaic word was to eat the pieces of a man. And I don't know, but I wonder if that's a connection back to this. Interesting there. Okay. Verse 25, I make a decree that eat the pieces of a man. That's what the word slander meant, to eat the pieces of a man. Could just be metaphorical or could have something to do with this. I don't know. Here he goes on. He says, I make a decree. He's writing this to all the world now, that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Perspective here. Daniel had to be, before this happened, had to be a legend. This is a guy that came in and rose to become prime minister of an empire. They've known about that he can interpret dreams. His buddies escaped the fiery furnace. He was written about in chapter 4. He saw the handwriting on the wall. Like the tales of Daniel for 70 years are huge. And then he goes into the lion's den and comes out. He's perfectly fine. So he has to be, if someone were looking for someone to worship, Daniel would be a great case, right? Like, wow, that's a guy. So be interesting to see how the Persians, he didn't live too much longer after this, but their respect for him had to go way up. The God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed and his dominion will be forever. This is a non-believer writing this, by the way, apparently. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And that went out to all the world. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And were those the same guys or two separate guys? That is the mystery right there. So that ends chapter 6. Now, talked about that there's multiple layers of it. Obviously, this is a historical event, famous event. Sunday school lessons have been talked about that for a long time. What's some practical applications of it? I mean, one, you can really get into like just the prayer aspect, right? Like he is faithful to pray, regardless of when praying is, you put some modern day examples of it here. Being able to do something when it might be against the law the world's laws, and it's coming to where it is. You look at the hatred laws in Canada and France, where you can't really preach the gospel because that's hate speech against another religion, right? And yet people do it. So there's a practical lesson to it. But there's also a prophetical element to this. And you could really get into, just for the sake of time, we're not going to, but you could look at this. This has a nice connection to what's going to happen in the end times, as far as the one world leader enforcing laws and what that goes in. But we're going to take a little bit different direction, because there's a cool connection between this and what's going to be coming up in a few weeks. And that is what they say is Christ's birthday. He wasn't born on December 25th, but let's just go along with it because we're going to celebrate Christmas. What is the connection, and why you won't understand the Christmas story unless you understand the lion's den? So let's take a look at this. This is what Matthew chapter 2 says. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east and have come to worship." Magi from the east. Who are the Magi? There's probably not one pastor in 10 that can explain who that is. And we're going to look at it here, because who are these? But they're looking for born King of the Jews. Now they're asking that to the King of the Jews, which is a little bit of a put down, right? Hey, we're looking, it'd be like, this, it's a bad example. You go up to President Biden and say, "Hey, I'm looking for the President of the United States," Well, I'm him. No, I really want to. Okay. And these guys, he comes there, and what are they looking? They saw a star in the east and have come looking for a king. Now, that's kind of hard to wrap your mind around if you really consider it. Who are these guys? Wise men from the east is what it says. That's what the Magi were. Were they really three guys on a camel? That's what it's all about. They know a king has been born because they saw a star. So that told them there was a king born. They're not even Jews, and they're looking for the King of the Jews. They're Iranians, right? They come from across the globe following a star. Well, that doesn't make sense. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? This is a slap in the face to Herod, who was the king of the Jews. He had been appointed king of Israel by Rome. We're going to get into that in a second. And they're asking for the real king of the Jews. So that's a little bit about this. Here's the mystery of the Magi. It's Latin from magoi, which is transliterated from the Persian language, okay? The Rab Mag was the chief of the Magi in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Jeremiah talks about that. There was these Magi, these priests of some sort that worked in the Babylonian Empire. And this is also Daniel's title. So whatever these Magi were, he was given the title he's the Rab Magi, chief of the Magi. So wherever they are, Daniel was chief of them. Keep this in mind here. So we got the Babylonian Empire. So even during the Babylonian Empire, up here in Media was where this priesthood were. And they're more than just priests. They had their own religion. And we're going to learn a little bit about them. But Nebuchadnezzar brought them in as part of his court. Okay, here's what verse 3 says. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. And you look at the translations, basically we would say he was freaking out. Why? Of three guys and a camel? And all Jerusalem with him. There's 500,000 people in Jerusalem. Why is the city freaking out over three guys and a camel? He was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. They're losing their mind over this. What's happening? Here's the Roman Empire at the time. Remember, we flash forward from Babylon, Persian, Greek. This is in the time of Christ. This is the Roman Empire. But there was also another empire called the Parthian Empire. It was the remnants of this Persian one, okay? Think Iran, Afghanistan, all that area. And the Roman Empire, by the way, all the empires of that metal man statue, if you look at them, they all tend to move west. You got Babylon and Persia, but then what follows them is the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. So that's west. And then you have the Roman Empire, which moved to like Italy. It's moving west. And if you follow that throughout history, the British Empire in the 1800s was even further west. And the American Empire in the 20th century, even further west. And some say this new century, this little country called China is going to take over. That's even further west. So it seems to be making its path around the planet. I don't know. But the Roman Empire was going west, and their power was over there. The problem was there was this remnant of the Persian Empire that kept attacking them. Think in our day and age, if Russia kept attacking Alaska, that's a long ways away from Washington, D.C. And we're constantly having to go over to Alaska to defend Alaska because that's part of that. That's part of what they were going for. And these Parthians were brutal. And in the middle of the two empires is this buffer zone known as Israel. So Israel's caught in the crossfire. And so they're always leery of, oh my gosh, here's another attack from them, right? So that's what's going on. And Herod was on shaky ground with Caesar. Here's why. Herod was king of the Jews, but he wasn't a Jew. It would basically be like if Canada took over America and the Canadians appointed a Canadian to come down there and govern Arkansas. And they're not an Arkansan, don't know anything about Arkansas, but, you know, they're Canadian. So it's a little bit about that. And Herod's had one job, keep the peace. And Caesar was who he listened to. So he's always worried about not keeping the peace under Caesar. All Jerusalem with him. A massive army from the Parthian Empire just rolled into town. It's not three guys on a camel. Here's what verse 4 says. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. This Messiah, where is he? They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And the prophet is going to be Micah. And in Micah 5:2, it talks about how he will come out of Bethlehem. So the scribes knew it. So the question is, if they were really following a star, why did they go to Jerusalem? Because the star took them to a certain house, which, by the way, it wasn't a star. That's all. No matter how big the star can be, as big as a moon, it's not going to show you which house to go to, right? So it's not a star. We'll touch on that later on, but it was something else. So who really were the Magi? Eastern religions say that there were actually 12 of them, okay? The Eastern, see, there's the East and West Roman religion. We're part of the West. Eastern religion says there were 12 of these guys, and that's why they celebrate Christmas on January 6th, and it's where we get the 12 days of Christmas. That's what that's all about. So people that are a part of the Far East, they actually have their Christmas on January 6th. Ours is the 25th, and that's 12 days later. Western religions say that there were 3 of these guys. In the 3rd century, they started the tradition that these guys were not actually Magi, they were kings. In the 6th century, they were actually given names, Belteshazzar, Melchior, and Gaspar. In the 8th century, they were said to be representatives from the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that went to Europe, Asia, and Africa. So they were 3 representatives for that. In the 1400s, it was changed that they were the king of Arabia, king of Persia, and king of India. And that's what we follow today. We believe that stuff that's kind of filtered down. Most people get their information about the Magi from Christmas cards and not from scripture. It's true. More on the Magi. Daniel became prime minister of Babylon, outlived that empire, and 70 years later became prime minister of the next empire, Persia. He was put in charge of the chief of the magistrates and given the title of the Rav Magi, which is chief of the Magi. Their skill was not astrology, which the Babylonians were into, which most people think it is, but instead it was dream interpretation. Isn't that interesting? What was Joseph's spiritual gift? Dream interpretation. And that was Daniel's. It's this religion called Neuromancy. And this actually became the state religion of Persia because Darius, after some of the Magi were considered to be expert in the interpretation of dreams, so he made this the state religion, this dream interpretation. The Magi were then assigned to the Persian court and had 2 responsibilities: the Persian priesthood, and they were kingmakers. These guys were basically the religious part, but also the political part. They assigned the next king, and they also governed. And so this was a powerful political force in Persia. At the time of Jesus' birth, they were the most powerful political and religious organization on earth. They would have entered Jerusalem with a massive entourage. That's why the city was freaking out. Not 3 guys in a camel. So what is the connection right here from Daniel 6 to Matthew 2? We just talked about the birth chart. What is the connection? Okay, let's get into this. Daniel's secret society, from the lion's den to the Lord. Daniel was called the prophet that God loved. Trivia question. I bet you Sandra, I'm going to put her on the spot, can get this. Who was the disciple that Jesus loved? John. There you go. Both of these guys are interesting. Daniel is going to get all the end time from the Old Testament, and so will John in the New Testament. These guys are kind of connected there. He is given prophecies of the end time and the coming of Christ. he will be told, you'll learn about this in a couple chapters. He was told by the angel Gabriel the exact day that Jesus would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He knew the year, the month, and the day 500 years in advance of this very day that Jesus, I mean, that's Gabriel telling that. He had specific details about Jesus's birth and ministry 500 years before he was born. Daniel knew all this. He was also put in charge of the Magi, which is a hereditary priesthood. That means it was a family of priests that he was given oversight to. After this lion's den incident, he was put second in command, and his task was over the priesthood that would be in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. Here's the Magi revealed. Daniel, kidnapped as a teenager, rose to prominence in 2 empires over 70 years, was uniquely positioned to lead a highly classified group who would know of the coming king and the very day and time he would make his appearance, and they were counting down the years for this world-changing event. Why was it that in Jerusalem, with all the Jews who had the Old Testament there, they didn't realize Jesus had been born? But some people from over in the Middle East who had been counting down the generations, because Daniel had trusted them, given them the prophecies. We're going to learn about that in the next 6 chapters. They were waiting. They knew the Messiah. They awaited the King of the Jews. Daniel probably knew some things that it's probably not even written down, but that's a pretty interesting thing. Okay, so we just crossed a major milestone here. We just finished up all the historical parts of Daniel. From here on out, it's going to get into all the prophecies. Okay, 7 through 12 is going to be prophecies at the end time. You're going to learn about the 4 beasts and what's going to happen in our near future. And we'll learn about Alexander the Great and also our near future. The 70 weeks is going to forecast our near future. And we'll go through all this. So what I want you to do is I want you to read chapter 7, the 4 beasts. This is interesting here. Remember we saw the statue, the metal man statue. And what that was, that's also something I would like as bonus time, go back and reread that. Because we saw in Daniel 2, we get this vision of all the world empires, 4 of which have already happened. Babylon, Persia, Greek, Rome. But then there's going to be this iron mixed with clay that is the revived Roman Empire or European Union or something like that, some kind of alliance that I'm going to call Rome 2.0. And that's the iron mixed with clay. But you're going to see in Daniel 7 these same empires. But Daniel 2 glimpses those from man's point of view. Daniel chapter 7 is going to see those same empires from God's point of view. And it's going to fill in the gap right here. We're going to get insights into it. Not that there's going to be a coming world empire, but we're also going to learn about there's going to be a coming world leader that oversees that empire and how that all plays out. So we're going to start filling in some of the gaps and make some sense of it. So